I'm sure you know JFK, but JKP, James Knox Polk, quietly redrew the entire map of North America in 4 years, and somehow gets less recognition than presidents who accomplish nothing at all. He's not alone. This is the story of the men who got a president assassinated over a job interview, out-trust busted the original trust buster, and steered the country through its most dangerous flood, and vanished from memory anyway. Believe it or not, the president's history forgot did some of the heaviest lifting in the job. Forget the faces on Rushmore for a second. Let's start with the guy who bought a third of the country and then just left. Polk himself was such a workhorse that he reportedly took a total of only about 2 months away from his desk in 4 full years as president. His wife Sarah ran the White House like a strict Presbyterian household. She banned dancing, hard liquor, and card games from the premises, which meant the most consequential territorial expansion in American history was negotiated inside what was probably the most boring party venue in Washington. James Knox Polk did not want to be a legend. He wanted a spreadsheet. In 1844, he ran for president on 4 specific promises, wrote them down, and told the country, "I will do these 4 things and then I'm going home." Nobody does that. Politicians promise the moon and deliver a pothole. Polk promised 4 specific things and delivered all 4, on schedule, then left the White House and was dead within 3 months of leaving office, worn completely to dust by the job. But before we get to the dying part, let's talk about what he actually pulled off, because it's one of the wildest real estate deals in human history. Here's the setup. In 1845, the United States looks nothing like the map in your head. No California, no Nevada, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico. The Pacific Coast is basically a rumor. Great Britain and the US are in a decades-long staring contest over the Oregon Territory, and Mexico still owns the entire Southwest. Polk walks in and treats this like a to-do list. Item 1. Settle the Oregon boundary with Britain instead of going to war over it, even though his own supporters were chanting 54-40 or fight, a slogan so aggressive it sounds like a wrestling move. Polk quietly used the slogan as leverage at the negotiating table, then split the difference at the 49th parallel, which is, and I cannot stress this enough, basically DoorDash to avoid a war with the British Empire. Nobody actually wanted to send warships across the Atlantic to fight over pine trees and beaver pelts. Treaty signed, June 1846. 0 shots fired. Item 1, closed. Item 2, acquire the Southwest. This one wasn't so polite. Polk sent General Zachary Taylor and roughly 3,500 American troops into a disputed stretch of land along the Rio Grande, land Mexico also claimed as its own, practically daring a confrontation. It worked. Mexican cavalry crossed the river, clashed with an American patrol, and 11 U.S. soldiers were killed or wounded. Congress within days and declared that American blood had been shed upon American soil. That's a debatable sentence. The land itself was contested, and plenty of Americans, including a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln, demanded Polk show them the exact spot. But it worked. Congress declared war almost unanimously, and over the next 2 years, the U.S. Army did something no foreign force had done before. It marched into Mexico City itself, stormed the castle at Chapultepec, defended in part by teenage military cadets who are still honored in Mexico today as Los Niños Héroes, and raised the American flag over the National Palace. An invasion that deep into a sovereign capital had never happened to Mexico before, and it hasn't happened since. The result? The Mexican Cession. More than 500,000 square miles, roughly 55% of Mexico's pre-war territory, for a payment of just $15 million, less than $2 an acre for California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and chunks of Colorado and Wyoming. One war, one signature, and the United States physically became a Pacific nation. But here's the twist nobody puts in the textbook. Gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California just 9 days before that treaty was signed. 9 days. Polk had no idea he'd just bought the most valuable piece of real estate acquired in American history. He thought he was getting farmland and a port. He got the California gold rush by accident. And then, true to his word, he didn't run for re-election. He served his one term, delivered on all 4 promises, and went home to Tennessee, physically destroyed by the pace of the job. He'd worked himself so hard that he died 103 days after leaving office. The most successful territorial expansion in U.S. history, executed by a man most Americans couldn't identify in a photo lineup. Rest easy, sir, you earned the nap. If Polk is the forgotten president who built the map, our next guy is the forgotten president who fixed the government running it, and he's got maybe the strangest redemption arc in the entire list. Chester Alan Arthur. If you know one thing about him, it's probably nothing. But stick with me because this story has a murder in it. If Polk is the forgotten president who built the map, our next guy is the forgotten president who fixed the government running it, and he's got maybe the strangest redemption arc in the entire list. Chester Alan Arthur. If you know one thing about him, it's probably nothing. But stick with me because this story has a murder in it. So when President James Garfield picked Arthur as his vice president in 1881, reform-minded Republicans were furious. This was like putting the fox in charge of henhouse security as a symbolic gesture. But, and here's where the story turns dark, there was a man named Charles Guiteau who believed, with zero evidence, that he was personally responsible for Garfield's election victory and that this entitled him to a plum government job. He wanted to be ambassador to France. He'd never held a real position in his life. He was by every account delusional, and he was rejected, repeatedly. So on July 5, 1881, Charles Guiteau walked into a Washington train station and shot President Garfield twice. Garfield didn't die instantly. He suffered for 79 excruciating days while doctors, some of them literally sticking unwashed fingers into the wound looking for the bullet, made things dramatically worse through infection. Alexander Graham Bell even built a metal detector prototype to try to locate the bullet, and it malfunctioned because of the metal bed springs. Garfield finally died in September 1881, and Guiteau's own explanation for the murder became the most damning indictment of the spoils system imaginable. He'd killed a president over a rejected patronage job. Now here's the irony. Chester Arthur, product of the machine, beneficiary of the exact system that had just gotten his boss assassinated, became president. Nobody expected anything from him. His own friends worried he'd protect the corrupt status quo that made him, but he didn't. Let's actually look at the man for a second, because Chester Arthur is one of the strangest, most underrated characters in this entire story. He was known as Elegant Arthur and the Gentleman Boss. The guy owned somewhere around 80 pairs of trousers and reportedly changed his outfit multiple times a day. When he first arrived at the White House after Garfield's death, he took one look at the place and reportedly refused to move in, calling it something close to a moldy barn, and made the government redecorate the entire residence before he'd sleep there. He redecorated by selling off 24 wagon loads of old furniture at auction and bringing in Louis Comfort Tiffany to redesign the interior. He also had a habit of throwing lavish midnight suppers for friends, wine included, in a mansion he'd just declared unlivable. This is not the profile of a reformer. This is the profile of a guy who cares about drapes. And privately, he was dying. Arthur had been diagnosed with Bright's disease, a fatal kidney condition, shortly after taking office, and he told almost nobody. He knew he likely had a limited amount of time left, and he made the deliberate choice to spend it doing the one thing his entire career had trained him not to do: dismantle the patronage system that made him. In 1883, President Chester Arthur signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. For the first time, federal jobs would be awarded based on competitive exams and merit, not political loyalty. It's the law that created the modern professional civil service, the foundation of how tens of thousands of federal jobs still work today. The man who owed his entire career to political patronage personally signed patronage's death warrant. Big mistake for the machine. Great outcome for the country. He didn't even get renominated by his own party in 1884. The machine he'd betrayed made sure of that. He left office quietly. His illness worsened, and he died a year and a half later. He'd reportedly ordered most of his personal papers burned before his death. A man who spent his life in politics, and in the end, didn't want history picking through his drawers. Before we get to the flood, let's talk about the guy who proves this pattern even applies to presidents people think they know something about. Say the name William Howard Taft to almost anyone and you'll get exactly one response. Wasn't he the one who got stuck in a bathtub? It's not even true. Historians have never found a single credible source for that specific story. It's an urban legend that somehow outlived every real thing the man did in office. What actually is documented, and is arguably funnier, is that Taft, who at his heaviest weighed around 340 pounds, genuinely needed a custom-built White House bathtub roughly 7 feet long, big enough that 4 average-sized men could reportedly sit in it together for a photo. No embarrassing rescue, just an ordinary Tuesday requiring an extraordinary tub. And that's almost poetic, because Taft's actual presidency is one of the most quietly aggressive economic reform records in American history, and nobody teaches it. Here's the setup. Taft took office in 1909 as the hand-picked successor to Theodore Roosevelt, the original trustbuster, the guy with the big stick and the bigger reputation. Roosevelt spent nearly 8 years cultivating an image as the man who'd take on giant monopolies. Taft spent 4 years as the quiet guy nobody thought had the stomach for it. But, and here's the part that should make Roosevelt fans a little uncomfortable, Taft's Justice Department filed roughly twice as many antitrust suits in a single term as Roosevelt managed in nearly 2. 90 separate cases against monopolies and price-fixing combines, compared to Roosevelt's 40-some over almost double the time in office. Taft went after Standard Oil and helped finish the case that eventually broke John D. Rockefeller's empire into more than 30 separate companies in 1911, several of which still exist today under names like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Marathon. He also broke up the American Tobacco Company's stranglehold on the cigarette market that same year. He did all of this without the swagger, without the safari photos, without the mythology. He was a legitimately reluctant president. The job he actually wanted his entire life was to sit on the Supreme Court, and in one of the great "be careful what you wish for" stories in American history, he eventually got it. After losing re-election in 1912 in a humiliating 3-way split with Roosevelt himself running against him as a third-party spoiler, Taft went on to become Chief Justice of the United States in 1921, the only person in American history to hold both the presidency and the top seat on the Supreme Court. He said more than once that he barely remembered being president, but he never forgot being Chief Justice. That's not a joke about a bathtub. That's a man who found out mid-career which job he was actually built for. Big mistake, Teddy, letting your quiet successor out-trust bust you and then getting embarrassed by your own comeback attempt. Roosevelt spent the 1912 campaign trail calling Taft weak, calling him a tool of big business, practically daring the country to remember him as the real reformer. Taft never even fought back publicly. He just kept filing lawsuits, kept quietly breaking up monopolies larger than most national economies, and let the paperwork speak for him. History rewarded the louder man with the mythology and rewarded the quieter man with a bathtub joke. That's not justice. That's just how memory works. Now jump forward more than 4 decades, to a president so quiet they nicknamed him Silent Cal, and to the moment that tested whether quiet could actually be a form of competence. Quick side note before the disaster, because it's too good to skip. This is a man who kept a pet raccoon named Rebecca in the White House, walked her on a leash around the grounds, and once let her join the Thanksgiving festivities instead of becoming dinner, because he'd apparently grown attached. A woman once bet Coolidge at a dinner party that she could get more than 2 words out of him. His reply? "You lose." That's the guy about to run the largest disaster response the federal government had attempted up to that point. In the spring of 1927, the Mississippi River did something it had never done before at that scale. Levees failed across 7 states. Roughly 27,000 square miles went underwater, an area comparable to the size of some entire New England states combined. Around 630,000 people were displaced. Some estimates put the death toll above 500. Entire towns simply ceased to exist as dry land. This was, statistically, the most destructive river flood in U.S. history, a disaster on a scale the federal government had never been asked to respond to before, in an era before FEMA existed, before the concept of coordinated federal disaster relief was even fully invented. And Calvin Coolidge, famously withdrawn, famously a man of almost supernatural restraint, did not personally tour the disaster zone. Critics have hammered him for that ever since. But behind the silence, he made a defining decision. He handed the response effort to his Secretary of Commerce, a young engineer named Herbert Hoover, and gave him real authority to coordinate rescue and relief across state lines. Hoover organized boats, camps, and supply chains for hundreds of thousands of displaced Americans in a matter of weeks, the largest peacetime relief operation the country had ever mounted up to that point. It effectively made Hoover's national reputation and helped launch him to the presidency 3 years later. But here's the twist buried in this crisis. Because so many black sharecroppers were forced into segregated relief camps under brutal conditions, and because so much of the flood's damage disproportionately hit black communities in the Delta, whose levees were sacrificed to save wealthier white areas upriver, the disaster quietly reshaped American politics for a generation. Historians now point to the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 as one of the accelerants of the Great Migration, hundreds of thousands of black Americans deciding in the flood's aftermath that the South offered no future and heading north instead. A flood most Americans have never heard of helped redraw the demographic map of an entire country. Silent Cal never gave a rousing speech about it. He just quietly let the machinery of the federal government work, kept the economy roaring through what became known as the Coolidge prosperity, and left office with the country richer than when he found it. One of the only presidents in history who genuinely could have walked away wealthier in trust than he arrived with. Nobody remembers him. He probably would have preferred it that way. Here's the twist that ties this whole story together. The men history forgets are disproportionately the ones who fixed things instead of breaking them. Polk didn't start a scandal. He finished a war and went home. Arthur didn't cling to power. He burned down the system that built him and then burned his own papers on the way out. Taft didn't posture for cameras. He quietly outworked the man whose legacy he was supposed to be a lesser copy of. Coolidge didn't grandstand through a disaster. He delegated to competent people and let the numbers do the talking. Compare that to the presidents everybody remembers. We remember the ones who lied, who got shot, who started wars, who got impeached, who got assassinated, who got elected during a crisis so vivid it became myth. Drama is memorable. Competence apparently is not. There's something almost cruel about that. The reward for quietly doing your job well is being erased from the collective memory of the country you did it for. And there's one more irony worth sitting with. Chester Arthur, the accidental reformer, only got the chance to change anything because a delusional man shot his boss over a job he didn't deserve. The entire modern American civil service, the system that still governs how millions of federal employees get hired today, exists because of an assassination triggered by patronage. The disease produced its own cure, and almost nobody remembers the doctor. So what do we actually owe these men? Polk gave the country its shape. Arthur gave the government its integrity, however incomplete. Taft gave the economy a fairer set of rules and quietly proved that competence doesn't need a nickname to matter. Coolidge gave a shattered river valley a functioning response and, without meaning to, helped set in motion one of the largest internal migrations in American history. None of them wanted a statue. None of them got one that anybody visits. But maybe that's the real lesson buried in these four stories. The health of a country isn't measured by the leaders you remember. It's measured by the ones who did the unglamorous work and then simply left because the job was done and the paperwork was filed and there was nothing left to brag about. So here's the question I'll leave you with. In an era obsessed with charisma and spectacle, is it even possible anymore for a quiet, competent president to get a fair shake from history? Or has the job itself changed so much that forgettable and good at it can no longer coexist? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to see what happens when a forgotten president does the opposite, takes a small, unremarkable moment, and turns it into a full-blown constitutional crisis, go check out our video on Andrew Johnson's impeachment. It's the story of exactly how not to follow a legend. And if stories like this, the ones history left on the cutting room floor, are your thing, hit subscribe. There are a lot more forgotten men in that ledger, and every single one of them has a moment worth remembering.